Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Supreme Court case overview. Today, we are tackling three cases you need to know for the AP test. That is Schenck versus United States, Tinker versus Des Moines, and New York Times versus United States. Now, as you can tell, these are three cases about the freedom of speech, and more specifically in the New York Times case, about the freedom of the press. And this is probably one of the most misunderstood topics in all of America, right? People are constantly making claims about what the freedom of speech is, what the freedom of speech is not. And part of our debate comes from the fact that these things have been debated over and over again at the Supreme Court. For the AP test, there are three cases that you need to know, each that help define what the limits of our freedom of speech really is and whether there are any limits at all. We're going to get into that today, but let's break down the core debate. When it comes to the freedom of speech and to a lesser extent, the freedom of the press, there's really two opposing issues here. The first is that if we're imagining why the freedom of speech exists, why would the founders have written that First Amendment? A slight myth goes that it's the First Amendment because it's the most important. This is total nonsense. It was originally going to be the Third Amendment, just out of point of interest, but the freedom of speech is important to democracy nonetheless, crucial, because if we cannot criticize our government, if we cannot criticize the people who are in charge, well, then really our discussion, our discourse, and even maybe our votes all become meaningless. Freedom of speech must allow for criticism of the government, and particularly doing that in public in a way where people can have their opinions and beliefs. But on the other hand, freedom of speech is an obvious risk, right? There is no question why many countries, in the name of order, they censor speech to this day. Why there are many, many countries around the world where freedom of speech, and even more so the press, is not a priority. And that's because it can cause disruption, particularly if we're in a time of crisis. I put a little picture there of our military guys, because just imagine if you're, a member of the military, right? You don't necessarily have the freedom of speech when talking to your commander, do you? And the reason for that is obvious, because freedom of speech disrupts order. So this freedom of speech and freedom of the press are a classic debate between liberty and order. How far does our liberty go? How much order do we get to disrupt before our liberties are no longer protected by the Constitution? All three of these cases deal with that. But in order to go into depth, we'll need to look at them case by case. First, 1919, we'll go to the case of Schenck versus United States. Charles Schenck, he was a member of the Communist Party of America, and he was distributing pamphlets. Okay, he was very concerned about World War I, and he encouraged non-violence. He encouraged people not to commit any violence at all, but to avoid the draft. You see, Charles Schenck was actually very concerned about another part of the Constitution, the 13th Amendment, which says we can't be put into slavery. He saw the draft, being forced to go fight for the United States, whether you agreed with the war or not, as a violation of that. And so he was making an argument, right? Now, he was actually convicted for this under a law that the United States had passed that prevented this sort of criticism. The question is, was this allowed, his conviction, or was this not allowed? Well, in one of the most heinous Supreme Court cases ever, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the United States. Yes, Charles Schenck could be convicted for this because his speech posed a, quote, clear and present danger to the United States. We were in a crucial war. Perhaps Schenck would convince people to dodge the draft. We wouldn't have soldiers, and the United States would lose that war. Now, in retrospect, even the authors of this opinion thought that they got it wrong. This is why it's so funny. If you've heard the phrase, oh, the First Amendment does not protect shouting fire in a crowded theater, well, that comes from this case, and that was later overruled. So just another funny misconception there. But this case is still very, very important to us, whether we agree with it or not, because in 1919, this was really the beginning of a wave of First Amendment cases. And right off the bat, we established something that is true to this day. What is that? Well, free speech is not absolute. Maybe even better, freedom of expression is not absolute. You do not get to say whatever you want because of the freedom of speech. Now, that seems obvious, but it's not at all obvious in the wording of the First Amendment. So this case is a useful piece of evidence when pointing to that the freedom of speech, the Supreme Court has ruled this, is not absolute. Now, let's go to the other end of the spectrum, right? An adult participating in this civic discourse to maybe a kid, a student. We go to 1968, we have the Tinker versus Des Moines case. Again, a time of crisis, a wartime case. And Tinker, Mary Beth Tinker, she was in junior high school. She was actually suspended for wearing a black armband to protest the Vietnam War. Now, this is interesting not only for the protest reasons, but because we have here a case of symbolic speech, right? The fact that she's wearing a black armband, she's not actually saying something, right? But that armband, her clothing, is saying something. That is still counted under the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech. So the question is, can she be suspended? I mean, she's not an adult after all, and perhaps children don't quite have the same freedom of speech rights. Well, the Supreme Court, in one of its best rulings on the freedom of speech, ruled that this suspension was unconstitutional. The freedom of speech applies to students, yes, and symbolic speech, yes. See, this case is important for two reasons. Really, overall, it just expanded the freedom of speech, but it clarified two things for us. One, yes, students get the freedom of speech. Students, you should take a lot of pride in the fact that basically the only time you are not welcome to express your freedom of speech, the Supreme Court ruled in Tinker versus Des Moines, is if you're going to cause a substantial disruption. So if you can find a way to spread a message that is not going to cause a substantial disruption, odds are it is protected by the Constitution. And we have a big hint as to one of the ways you can do that, symbolically. Symbolic speech, that is the sharing of a message, not through your actual words, but through something like clothing. Another example of symbolic speech that comes up a lot is burning the American flag. This has also been protected by the Supreme Court as an example of symbolic speech. But let's go a little bit further. In both of these cases, we have Schenck, a member of a fringe party, and then we have Tinker, who's just one student at a school district. And yes, that speech matters, but what if the speech is potentially more consequential? What if, for instance, we're talking not about an individual, but about, the most widely read newspaper in the United States, like the New York Times? Where do their protections begin and end? Well, we wouldn't need to wait long from Tinker versus Des Moines to get the answer. In 1971, the case of New York Times versus United States clarified how the freedom of speech rights connect to freedom of the press rights. In short, the New York Times had gotten their hands on these things called the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were the result of a very long study conducted by the US government. The US government was really trying to figure out why we were in the Vietnam War in the first place, when so much of the widely held consensus within the government was that the war had long been unwinnable. Now, these papers obviously were very damaging to the government's reputation. It didn't make the United States look very good. And so the government wanted to make sure that they could stop the publication of the Pentagon Papers when the New York Times published their first article and said there was going to be more coming. This idea is called prior restraint, right? Can the government go before something is published, say, no, it is illegal to publish that? Well, the Supreme Court in this case took the side of New York Times. They said this type of stopping the publication was unconstitutional. You can even print, if you are in the press, government secrets. This is allowed. Now, there is a fine line here. You cannot print government secrets if, for instance, it is going to lead to damaging of U.S. life. Right? So there is some of that Schenck that comes here, where if there is a very real threat as a result of this publication, people will die, for instance, then you can't publish that. However, in this case, no one was going to die from the publication of the Pentagon Papers. The US government was just going to be humiliated. That's not a good enough reason for the government to stop its publication. And so this case was really all about limiting prior restraint, bringing the freedom of the press, you might say, up to that same level as the freedom of speech that you and I have. And this is crucially important. If you have prior restraint, the Supreme Court said, well, you really don't have a First Amendment. So how might these cases come up when you're asked to write about them and apply them to other Supreme Court cases? Well, the first one that I'll tell you, the Supreme Court has ruled many, many times on the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, rights of students. And so you could very easily see how you could be asked to connect Tinker versus Des Moines to any of those other cases. Additionally, the Supreme Court has been constantly evolving its standard on these things. I told you that the 1919 case, Schenck versus the United States, while it established that the freedom of speech is not absolute, has been overruled, depending on which scholar you agree with, maybe 2 or 3 times. And that's because the Supreme Court is constantly evolving its standard on potentially dangerous speech. One thing you might want to know is that the current standard, speech is not protected if it is going to incite imminent lawless action. That means as an immediate consequence of your speech, somebody is going to break the law. There cannot just be a vague threat or worry from your speech. That's still okay. But the second your speech is directly instructing people to commit violence or some other lawless action, that is when speech is no longer allowed. And there have been many cases here where Schenck versus United States, well, that standard has really been modified over the last 100 years. Thanks for tuning in today. I hope this helps you with these 3 very important cases in understanding our rights and in what you need to know for the AP test. Thanks so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day.